After that, if people could use the chat basically to get say that they would like to ask a question, and Jason and I will just call on people. You can unmute yourself, you can open your video if you prefer, and we'll take questions that way until time runs out. I believe that we had scheduled this until 1 p.m. So that's just, please prioritize your questions, planning on ending at 1. And with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate you and Jason helping me with this press event today. As you can imagine, my staff is asleep because we've had a very, very hectic week. And I am thrilled that yesterday the Portland City Council unanimously voted to send a referral to the ballot that I believe will be a national model for how community members hold their community police force accountable for community norms and community expectations. As all of you know, this is just one piece in what has become an international movement to ensure that we do not have police that over-police some populations at the expenses of those communities. In Portland, we are not immune to over-policing in the city of Portland. As you know from the variety of audits that have been done, I was laughing earlier because you can see this. These are just the audits and reports on police activity that I have in my home. If I had been in my office, probably had 3 times as many of these. But what yesterday did was put us on the path to have a real community dialogue about what community safety looks like and how do we hold police accountable for what the community perceives as inappropriate behavior. I have been involved in this activity for over 30 years, and I've served on many task forces that wanted to ensure that there was a community-driven oversight board with subpoena power, with the ability to conduct investigations, with the ability to implement discipline, and with the ability to operate in a way that would be transparent and fair to all parties concerned. I also want to thank Portland Forward because I reached out to them because, as you can imagine, as a sitting city commissioner, I cannot run a campaign ballot measure out of my office. And so I reached out to Portland Forward because of their expertise in running ballot measure campaigns. And I will be working with them to build a steering committee that will be diverse and to hire a campaign manager and to raise money to make sure that we have the ability to have this detailed conversation in every corner of the city of Portland. I suspect that Portland Business Association will spend $1 million to try to defeat this measure because every time in the past we've tried to put real teeth into accountability, the association has fought back. So I was not surprised with them asking for an investigation of me or them alluding to the fact that my proposal is not legal. I will say that as this proposal, assuming voters support it, and I have every expectation that they will overwhelmingly support this ballot measure, when voters support it, we will also still need to make sure that at the state level, and I hope that happens in August rather than next year, we change the arbitration rules so that a community-driven oversight board would be the final authority. I also know that we have to make other changes at the state level. In January, we start once again negotiating the contract for Portland Police Association. And so none of this is easy or simple, but all of it will be happening simultaneously. And in 18 months after this measure passes, what we will have is a community-driven oversight board in place that will hold public servants that are community police officers accountable for inappropriate behavior. So thank you all for being here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Go ahead, Sarah, and thanks. If people can do like Sarah did, so we'll take Sarah and then Rick and then Everton, and then if people want to continue to kind of raise their hand in the chat, I'll call people out. Sarah?
Hello, Commissioner Hardesty, and
Hi.
I will actually
Hi, Sarah.
my video on too, so you can see who the heck I am. We've met multiple times. Hi.
Yes, we have.
I have two questions. One, how would this look in terms of appointing folks to this board? Are there any limitations, people who couldn't be on it, that kind of thing? Can you kind of break down what that would look like? We'll start there.
Yes, and so that will be the work of the commission. And so the ballot measure passes in November. In January, we seat a commission that will answer the details about all the stakeholders who have a stake in policing in our community. And so I suspect there will be business representation. There will be representation from the houseless community. There will be representation from communities of color. And so as of now, I couldn't even tell you the number of people that would be on the board, but the goal is to have the board reflect the community that is being protected and served. The initial committee, the ballot measure clearly states that police officers and their family members and former police officers are not allowed to serve on the committee because, again, it's a community driven and we don't want it taken over by any special interest.
And then just one quick other question.
Okay.
I have a reporter, another colleague of mine, working on something else. And I just wanted to get in a question to you that they wanted me to ask you, if that's okay. Just
all right,
really
well,
quick.
I'll tell you if it's not.
You said if you get a chance, maybe you could ask this. What do you think of the agreement that Governor Brown forged with Pence? Do you think it's good enough?
I think I was very proud to meet with Governor Brown and the mayor and the police chief and the superintendent of Oregon State Police the day before that agreement was announced. There was clearly give on all sides. Clearly, the federal government wants to save face because, of course, they say they came here and saved Portland from itself. And so, but we are united, elected leader-wise around the state. The feds have to leave. We have to get them out of here. And so the agreement included the governor lending us 100 Oregon State Patrol officers for up to 2 weeks to replace the federal officers who were sent here by 45. But I also agreed to open fire stations again so that staging areas could be set using Portland Police as well as Oregon State Patrol. And as you know, I cut off access when I couldn't determine whether Portland Police were embedding the federal secret police into their operation. And so I eliminated access for any police to do staging at fire stations. And so I've released that with the exception of the feds. I still will not allow any federal anybody's on fire station property. The other thing is that the Oregon State Police are coming with a mindset that they are here to protect protesters' right to free speech, right to assembly, and right to have their voice heard. That is a totally different mindset than the federal secret police came to Portland with. They came to contain, abuse, and terrorize community members. And so just a shift in tone, I think, will help a whole lot. We also have an agreement that unless to save somebody's life, there will be no tear gas. Oregon State Police say they don't tear gas people for crowd control. And if they ever had to use tear gas, that decision would be made at the highest level of their organization. Portland Police could learn a thing or two from Oregon State Police, and I think they will in this partnership. The other thing that I made very clear in the negotiations, that in no circumstances should Portland police officers be engaged in dialogue with federal agents. Oregon State Police will take that role, and if there is a need to communicate, the federal to the state will be the appropriate way to do that. We will have an Oregon State Patrol officer embedded in the Portland Police Command Center, and they will be the only ones with authority to engage with the federal, whether it's the secret police, whether it's Homeland Security, whether it's any of the other alphabet soup that's been sent here to terrorize Portlanders.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have Rick, then Everton, then Jeff.
Thank you. I'll start the video. My name is Wright Gasway with K2. I'm on a colleague's laptop. Commissioner Hardesty, thank you for taking the time. Chief Lavelle just said today that he would prefer that someone with law enforcement experience be on this board because they would understand the context of the job and what goes into their decisions. Can you explain why you disagree with that?
Well, let me just say that the premise that that police in general have promoted is that only police can determine whether or not police have been involved in misconduct. And I thoroughly disagree with that. Clearly, all of us saw the officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck. You don't have to be a police officer to know that was wrong, that was criminal behavior, and those officers should be prosecuted. Clearly, we're not going to put a board together that is just anti-police. The board has to represent all the stakeholders who have a stake in community safety. And so I disagree that the board will be less impactful, less knowledgeable without having a police officer sitting on it. But I'm not surprised that police would be using that narrative because that's what we have now. All the oversight systems assume that police are the experts in determining whether police have committed misconduct.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Next, I have Everton, then Jeff, then Nick.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the time. So I have two quick questions. Commissioner Hardesty, the auditor has repeatedly said that there are state laws and city code changes that are needed to remove other barriers outside of the city charter. At this point, do you know how likely those changes are likely to happen?
Well, I think those changes are very likely. We have a very engaged legislative body that will be going into special session in August. I have spoken with the People of Color Caucus and the committee that's been put together to look at police accountability in Salem. I can tell you that I am having conversations regularly with our legislators to make sure that in the special session, a strengthened arbitration bill comes through. I have every confidence that we have the time to get all the changes necessary so that after this measure passes, it will be in fact able to be fully implemented and it will stand up to any court challenges at all.
Gotcha. Thank you. And my second question, I'm sorry to have to ask, but I think it's important that you be given an opportunity to address it. Mayor Wheeler today held a press conference and said that you've been receiving racist emails. And so I was wondering if there's any way that you can elaborate on the amount of racist messages you've been receiving, if it's just stopped at emails, and if you have any idea on if this is in regards to you being so outspoken about local policing reform or if it's because of other reasons.
Yes, it is because I've been so outspoken around police reform. And quite frankly, I've been outspoken the same way for 30 years. The only difference is people are listening now and we're changing policy now. And so the racists have come out in full force. The white supremacists have come out in full force. I get letters to my home that are very vile and nasty and threatening. I get emails, texts, all my social medias. I have blocked more people in the last 60 days than I have blocked in the entire time I have been on Facebook. Actually what it shows is that the public dialogue is shifting, and it is shifting from a police narrative to a community justice narrative. It is never without risk that you take on policing. I mean, I've been doing it for 30 years, so I know when you take on police, first they try to discredit you. First they laugh at you, then they try to discredit you, and then you win. And so I have been shocked at the high level of racist, white supremacist rhetoric that's taking place. And honestly, I've been very disappointed that Portland Police has not played more of a role in actually addressing this both publicly and in their investigations.
Thank you. Next, we have Jeff, then Nick, and then Zach.
Hi, Commissioner. Good to talk with you again.
Hi, Jeff.
Yeah, been a few years. Wanted to talk to you a little. You alluded to the issues that have been raised about court challenges to this measure, but I want to get more specifically your response to this argument that's frequently been made by opponents that this is just all going to be tied up in litigation for years. Is that a concern to you?
Not at all. I spent a lot of time prior to submitting this ballot measure talking to both city attorneys and expert legal advisors on contracts before we ever submitted this. I am absolutely confident that A, the Portland Police Association will try to fight it, and B, that they will lose. It is absolutely a legally sound document. And it is a distraction to the real conversation about what does community safety look like and how do we get to a community where everyone feels that their civil rights are protected by whoever the first responder may be.
As a quick follow-up, I wanted to broaden it out a little bit. How big of a part of what you want to accomplish in terms of, all the protests that have occurred, in terms of changing policing, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, is this policing measure? And also, how far do you think you've gone at this point? Can you go out to people who are protesting and saying, we're meeting your concerns? Or are you really do you think a long way off from doing that?
Well, I think, let me talk about the measure itself. The measure is just one piece in totally rethinking community safety. There's a lot of community effort wanting to still continue to review the police budget. The mayor and I have committed to reviewing all the specialty units within Portland Police. My office is taking the lead on putting a work group together to go through the police budget in anticipation of the fall bump. Clearly, the community continues to demand we cut $50 million out of the police budget. We have cut $27 million so far, and we have invested some of those dollars in programs that take us away from a law and order approach with the Portland Street Response. So part of the money has been invested in a non-law enforcement approach to 911 calls on the street. Now, protesting is as American as apple pie in Portland, right? People will be protesting forever. I suspect protests will continue until the election and maybe after the election. I think what will be different is that the tone and the tenor will no longer be focused on federal buildings, but will be focused on what will it take us as a city, a county, a state to ensure that Black lives really matter after the protests are over, right? Because it's fabulous to come out every night and say Black Lives Matters, but if we don't change policy, if we don't start investing our dollars differently, then a year from now, Black lives won't matter again because we've done nothing to fundamentally change the systems that create the inequality in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next, we have Nick, then Zach, then Rebecca.
All right. Hi, Commissioner. Thanks so much for your time. Senate Bill 1604, the police arbitration bill, groups like Unite Oregon and others, and I think James Offsink have submitted testimony on the legislation, suggesting that it would actually obstruct accountability potentially. I'm wondering, have you looked at that and how it would interact with your measure? And then I have a follow-up question
Well, yes. Clearly, the bill that we just passed in Salem is a good first step. But if you look at the history of arbitration, especially for police, what the city has almost a zero success record at standing up to arbitration. Normally the police union wins. And the reason the police union wins is if you don't have a record of disciplining people for the same behavior, then you can't just one day discipline someone and expect it to pass arbitration. So what we did in Salem with 1604 is just the first start. What we know is that unless we change the arbitration process to allow a community-driven effort to supersede collective bargaining agreements, that we will not successfully be able to have a community oversight board. There is the appetite there. The Speaker of the House says that she's committed to getting it through the special session. And so I have every confidence that we will strengthen that bill so that it gives us the grounding that we need to actually truly implement this independent oversight board.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to follow up. This is a change of topic to the protests, and you've been vocal in the past about tactics and your support for peaceful protests, which has gotten you some backlash at your vigil and elsewhere. And of course, I'm old enough that I remember when you were on KBOO back in 2003, telling the protesters on the Steel Bridge, the small group of black blockers that charged the police, that they need to rethink their tactics. In 2016, you criticized the groups that were taking over City Hall and obstructing meetings. What do you think about the tactics that are being deployed by the more aggressive groups that are going out there downtown late at night?
Well, I think there's been different groups showing up at different times, right? Let me say that I am a child of the civil rights movement. I was taught to protest in a nonviolent, direct action way. That is who I am. That is me at my core. But I cannot condemn people who are frustrated to the point where they're busting windows. I cannot condemn people who have been brutalized by federal forces and Portland police over the last 2 months when they throw water bottles at them. I can't condemn them because I understand the frustration of continuing to try to seek justice and not getting it. Me personally, anytime I organize a protest, it will always be peaceful. I've organized hundreds of them in the city of Portland, and never once has anybody been tear gassed, arrested, or brutalized. But that's me. And when I do it, I have a clear expectation of how other people will participate. I cannot police other people's protests.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. So next we have Zach and then Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. Thanks you for taking my question. Question for you, Commissioner. The Portland Police Bureau is already understaffed. How might this affect solicitation of strong, ethical recruits?
Well, I still do not believe that Portland Police Bureau is understaffed. I believe that Portland Police Bureau has a problem with how they deploy their personnel. When you have 900 police officers and only 300 of them are available at any time to be on the street on patrol, we have to ask ourselves what the other ones are doing. So, for example, we had 28 gang enforcement officers that for 14 years rode around looking for gang members. They didn't answer calls. They didn't back up their colleagues. They didn't do anything but ride around looking for gang members. They had as much overtime as they could stand. And guess what? Their actual conviction rate, the last time I looked, was around 0.15%. And none of that could be tied directly to gang activity. And so, again, I think it's a deployment issue. I don't think it's a staffing issue. And no matter how often they say they're overworked and underpaid, the reality is that Portland police have for a long time decided what they will investigate and what they won't. The police have one job, and that one job is to solve crime. And unfortunately, we have them responding to houselessness issues, mental health issues, We're having them act as if they're social workers, and they don't have the training or expertise for that. If we can get police back to just doing policing, and if we can invest in community resources, the future says we will need a lot less police, and we will need police that will imagine their job a lot differently. We don't need police officers who see themselves as an occupying force that's going to dictate behavior in communities. And if we're ever going to have community police officers, we must change how we recruit, how we train police officers, and we must fire that one psychologist in Lake Oswego who seems to be the only person who determines who's fit and who isn't to be a law enforcement in the state of Oregon. And the last thing I will say is I'm on the governor's Department of Public Safety Standard and Practices work group to look at fundamentally changing how we train law enforcement throughout the state. I've only had one meeting with them, but it's really clear to me that that is a state agency that wants to tinker around the edges and not do the radical change that is required so that we get a new type of law enforcement officers coming through the door.
Thank you. One follow-up to that. You mentioned in the past, recently in the last week or two, that you would like to have Mayor Wheeler hand over the job of police commissioner to yourself. Is that something that you would still like to happen?
I would be very happy to take it. Honestly, I don't want the police bureau, but I would take it if the mayor gave it to me. When I asked him for it, I was absolutely outraged that I had just left a peaceful protest. The last song was playing. People were dancing and singing in a very mellow mood. And 10 minutes after I left, I find out people were tear gassed indiscriminately. And it just appalled me. And when I called the mayor and said, look, Mayor, you know, I had staff, I had loved ones down at the federal building, and nothing negative was happening. And they were tear gassed. You need to do something. And his response was, well, I got briefed by the police this morning and they said blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, if the only people you're hearing from are police, then you need to broaden the people you're listening to. And I think that's part of the disconnect that the mayor has from what is really happening on the street in Portland. I think getting tear gassed himself may have had an impact on him and his understanding of what happens when 60 plus days, and whether it's federal agents or whether it's Portland police officers, being tear gassed consistently during a pandemic should not be allowed any way, shape, or form. And so the mayor and I have we have agreed to disagree on whether or not I'm the appropriate person to manage the police bureau at this time. But I certainly won't stop asking for it, and I certainly won't stop working on reforming the police bureau from my position of not having it in my portfolio.
And then one quick thing is, earlier when someone asked a question, you mentioned secret police. What is secret? What do you mean, or who is the secret police?
My understanding is that 45 reviewed the Patriot Act and decided that these missionaries that normally are hired to go and wreak havoc in Black and brown countries all over the world for the sake of looking for terrorists, for the very first time, they have been deployed on American soil against people who are standing up against police brutality. And so the ironic nature of having people who have no training, who have no expertise in crowd control, who aren't from this community, who weren't asked to be here, being sent in by a rogue president to terrorize the community. So that's what I mean by secret police, because most of the time you can identify a police officer by the insignia on their uniform. These folks are in army fatigues with no insignias, so you can't tell whether they're Homeland Security, Border Patrol, jailers, or just contract missionaries that have been sent in to terrorize Portland. So that's what I mean when I say secret police.
Thank you.
And then how do we hold them accountable, I would say, right? Because at least in Portland, and that's another story about whether we can hold them accountable with them having their name badges covered. But if you're injured by one of these federal occupiers, what's your right to actually seek redress? You don't even know what part of the federal government to go to file your complaint, and that's a huge problem.
Okay, next we have Rebecca, and then we'll come back to Rick. Well, or Rick, I don't remember.
Hi, Commissioner. Rebecca here from OPB. I came a little late, so forgive me if this has already been asked, but I had a question on protests. Obviously, you've long been critical of how these protests have been policed. And tonight, we're going to see a change with federal officers supposed to be leaving and 100 or so state police coming in. And I'm really curious if you think we're going to see anything different tonight and in the coming nights when it comes to de-escalation of these protests. Basically, is tonight going to look any different than what we've seen play out in the last few weeks?
Yes, I'm hoping this weekend will be a weekend of celebration and turning a corner. The fact that the fence has come down around the federal building, the fact that even as we're speaking, there are people scrubbing the graffiti and bad words off federal property downtown. The fact that there will be no boogeyman, right? There'll be no federal presence there. The fact that the Oregon State Police will be taking a very officer-friendly approach. They're very clear that they are here to protect protesters, and they are not here to battle and abuse people who are exercising their free speech rights. And so I think the public tonight, if it's true that the feds really are gone, I think the public will see and feel a huge difference in both police actions and police behavior. We don't anticipate you seeing a lot of police during the protest tonight. And in fact, if you see them, it will be because they're engaged in conversation and dialogue. I'm hoping that Portland Police will learn a thing or two about de-escalation from Oregon State Patrol.
Can I ask one follow-up on that? Mayor Wheeler just had a press conference where he talked about how you, the superintendent of the state police, and Police Chief Chuck Lavelle had come to some sort of unified standard around the risk of serious injury or death, but I didn't have a chance to ask him what that meant, and I was hoping you might be able to explain a little more.
So what that means is that we're all in agreement that Portlanders have been tear gassed enough, and whether it's by Portland Police or whether it's been since July 1st when the federal secret police arrived. And the only reason to use tear gas when the federal government has left will be to save life, period. There is no tear gas for crowd control, no tear gas because a water bottle got thrown at you and your feelings got hurt. That will be the only reason that anybody will use tear gas and save someone's life, and that's officer or community member.
Okay, and this is state police are being asked to follow these standards.
Well, actually, the state police have higher standards than the Portland Police Bureau does, because in the conversation, Superintendent Travis, and I'm blanking on his last name, was actually shocked to learn that Portland police use tear gas as a crowd control mechanism. So that made me feel 100 times better about having Oregon State Police here, because clearly they say if they use tear gas, it's because they have received permission at the highest level of their organization. And so they will be the model and they will be in the lead. And so I hope that Portland Police will learn how to de-escalate based on the example that will be set by the Oregon State Police. And I am very grateful to Governor Brown for reaching out to Vice President Pence and actually starting the process of negotiating this agreement. As you know, a couple of days ago, the mayor and I sent out a joint statement and said, we're going to talk to the the acting director of Homeland Security. Even though we didn't want to, we figured we had to, because ultimately, last night was the most violent night of these federal occupiers. And again, there were 1,000 people doing nothing but chanting Black Lives Matters when they were attacked. And I don't know if the media has actually paid attention to the fact that they have broken out the windows in the federal building so that it's easier for them to shoot projectiles into protesters at these events. And that's an occurrence that started a week ago. So they came here because of $50,000 of damage, they said, and they busted out windows to make it easier to attack our community member. And so I'm hoping that this weekend will be a full weekend of celebration. And then next week, we can get to the hard work of actually doing police reform.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The last question we have queued up is from Wright. If there's anyone else who would like to ask a question before we close, please just indicate it in the chat. Right?
Thank you. I definitely should have just followed up when I first asked the question. Commissioner Hardesty, you said the ballot measure will be voted on in November, and then January commission would be seated to kind of iron out some of the details as far as how many people would serve and who would serve. Yes. There are critics that say maybe that's backwards. How do you respond to that? That the ballot measure will be voted on before those questions will be answered.
Yes. Well, let me give you the complete picture. Right, I am actually 2 years ahead of my city council career. I had anticipated that the only way to get truly independent police oversight would have been through the Charter Commission that starts its work in January of next year as well. And so I thought, I put in those 3 specialty units, the gun violence reduction team, school resource officers, and transit police 3 times before I was actually able to cut those out of the Portland Police budget. And so what I know is that what we need in the charter is the framework, right? So the charter is not supposed to contain all the details about how this board would operate. And so, but putting a frame in the charter says that this is what we as a city are going to do. Because the commission that will be actually putting together the oversight board will be meeting simultaneously when the Charter Review Commission is meeting. If there was something else we should have put in the charter, or if there's something else that we think maybe we should take out of the charter, we will have a 2-year process that's working simultaneously with the commission to make any changes necessary. I think that the auditor and the Portland Police Association want to nitpick whether or not this measure has been fully vetted. And I want to remind you, Rick, that this is not a new request. I was on the commission that Vera Katz put together back in 2000 when the latest oversight committee over Portland Police resigned in one fell swoop. Everybody resigned because they were frustrated that they were not able to hold police accountable for inappropriate behavior, right? And so here we are now, 2020, and the exact same request that came out of 2000 is the same request that I'm moving forward in 2020. It has been vetted over and over and over again by community stakeholders. And honestly, the police will never want anyone to hold them accountable other than themselves. And so that's the question that voters will have to answer. Do you trust the community to hold police accountable for the kind of community policing you want? Or do you think only police have the expertise to hold police accountable? We've seen what happens with this system. How many people have lost their lives at the hands of Portland Police, and 2 weeks later we hear they did nothing wrong? I think any loss of life, somebody did something wrong. So even if it wasn't criminal, there needs to be some change in how we train. There needs to be some counseling for officers who use excessive force, because honestly, you can't kill somebody that's unarmed and not suffer from that emotionally yourself. And we don't do any of that right now, right? So it is important that the community is the one that's in the driver's seat. Normally, the only role the police has asked the community to play is to demand the city council give them more money. And so I'm actually asking the community to play a much bigger role.
And if they approve that in November, it's important for them to note it will take a while to implement. It will not be.
It's not overnight, and so the auditor's concerned that what's going to happen to investigations? I can tell you that before the DOJ, Civil Rights Division came to Portland in 2010, and I was part of the group that asked them to come and investigate Portland Police. the IPR threw out more than 60% of the complaints they got in. And they would throw them out for reasons like the person was houseless, so they didn't have a phone number, so we're not going to investigate this. Or they didn't know the police officer's name, so we're not going to investigate this. The DOJ made IPR take in more complaints. But if you look at their complaints, they have a very hard time finding police have done anything that's out of policy, and because they are heavily influenced by the police in making their decisions. And so if we're ever going to have a community police force that the community controls, this ballot measure gives us the best chance to make that happen.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Jeff?
Yes, one follow-up question on the tear gas issue. You talked about the new standard that the state police and the Portland police will use, that no use of it unless, human life is at risk. At one point, as I understand it, you and Commissioner Daly, perhaps other commissioners, were working on further restrictions that would, go into ordinance. Are you still working on those? What's the status of that?
We did not do it because, as you know, the federal court has actually banned Portland police from using tear gas and from arresting and abusing protesters. Protesters and media. So we have not moved that forward yet. And we held it back because the mayor wants to put a use of force work group together. But we're going to give him a little time to make that happen. And if that doesn't happen, it's very likely that ordinance would come back.
Jeff, were you in the middle of saying something?
Oh, no, I just said thank you very much. Sorry.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, before we leave, I think Jason had one thing that he wanted to mention.
Yeah, I just want to thank all the media for being here today. On behalf of Portland Forward, James and I will be working with Commissioner Hardesty to build a wide, diverse steering committee from across the city. We'll be announcing sometime our formal steering committee in the near future. We have set up a PAC. James will put in the chat there the name of the PAC, which will be helping run the campaign. We do plan to start fundraising immediately because we do expect a large challenge from the police on this. And I would ask the media, the key question to me is, of excessive force, deadly force cases for internal affairs investigations over the last 10 or 15 years, someone needs to have the Portland police come out with an answer as to how many of those were actually substantiated versus unsubstantiated or exonerated, because that's the true stat. You as the press don't get to read the internal affairs documents, but I do as a civil rights lawyer, and I can tell you it's never substantiated in all my 11 years of doing this. I think the key question for the police in this campaign will be for them to come up with what that statistic is, because that's the real reason we're doing this, is that police investigating police has not led to an outcome of citizens stopping police excessive force cases.
Well, thank you all so much. Really greatly appreciate you making the time to come because it's a lot easier for me to have you all come and join us in one fell swoop than to do all these individually. Hope you all have a fabulous weekend. And thank you, Jason, and thank you, James, for helping facilitate this conversation. Thank you all. Bye-bye.